Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the brain. All the different areas of the brain, different ways we can where different functions are happening. We're talking about memory, we're talking about mood, talking about all kinds of good stuff here. Talk a lot about the cortex functions here in this section. Also talk about the hypothalamus, limbic system, and then some brain activity. So we'll kind of cover things like seizure again. We'll also talk about sleep as well. You guys are pretty familiar with in this class, if I had to guess. Cortex. So looking at the cortex, and again, hopefully you re-downloaded the slide set because I had to update this. I noticed an error. But anyway, so there's a couple of different cell types that are occurring here. And if you're actually looking at the cortex, let me get the laser pointer. You kind of see the organization here. Again, this is kind of more superficial, kind of going more deep as you go down here. You can kind of see the different organization of the neurons here and kind of how they're going to be organized. There's a couple of different varieties. So we're going to have things like granular cells, otherwise known as stellate cells. These are pretty short sort of axons. The signals they're transmitting are not going to be very far, usually good for kind of interneurons or very short distance sort of communication from one cell to another. Typically, these are either going to be excitatory, they're going to release things like glutamate, they may be inhibitory, releasing things like GABA. Just depends on what you're going to what kind of neurons you're running into, right? There's going to be some fusiform fibers. These are going to be output fibers. They're going to be sending signals elsewhere. And that kind of makes sense because you can see kind of these little kind of short neurons here. But what do you notice about as you get deeper here? A lot further, longer axons, a lot further transmission is going to be happening here. So we'll look at that in a second. And then we're also going to have these pyramidal fibers. These are also going to be output fibers. These are much longer. They're going to be heading all the way out down to the spinal cord. We talked a lot about the pyramidal tracts and whatnot yesterday, right? And how that's really important for controlling things like muscle movement, etc. Also, you're going to find some of these subcortical associations. These bundles will actually pass from one major brain area to the other. So when I'm doing things like reading something on a page and I'm taking that picture from my eyes and I'm translating that into actual thoughts and whatnot, this is where these pyramidal fibers are going to be very useful. They're going to be able to transfer from different areas of the brain so that I can look at a word, understand what that word means, and then perhaps read that word back to you, say if I was looking at something on my slide. And here, I'm not going to ask you specifically, you know, what each layer is or what it does necessarily. I just want to kind of give you an idea of what you're going to be seeing here. So looking at these three layers, again, these are mainly going to be this kind of short sort of granular neurons where they have a lot of intracortical associations, just going short distances within the cortex here. And you kind of see that in the first three layers or so. As you get deeper, this is where we're going to have things like, you know, incoming sensory signals are going to be terminating here. And again, we're going to find that the thalamus is going to be very important for making sure we get all the kind of sensory input coming to the right places. That's going to be important. And then there's a lot of output fibers here, right? Either going to the thalamus or heading to the brainstem and the cord. Those are going to be your deeper fibers, typically longer, going to be sending those signals longer distance there, right? Okay, so looking at this, we can find that relating the thalamus back to the cortex, we're going to find different areas of the brain are going to be responsible for different functions, as we're going to see here in a second. Now, there's a lot of different afferent and efferent signals are going to be traveling between the thalamus, so it's very important that that occurs. And actually, what you find is that patients who have damage being done, say, to the thalamus, have a lot of deficiencies in the cortex. You're going to see, so really problematic there, because the thalamus is responsible for almost all the excitation in the cortex, because most of the signals, especially input signals from sensory nerves, are going to be traveling through the thalamus to the cortex eventually. Okay, we call this the thalamocortical system here, and it's a two-way communication between the cortex, the thalamus, and back again. Okay, as I mentioned, almost all the sensory information is going to be passing from that thalamus to the cortex to inform things like how should we initiate movement, what kind of thoughts am I feeling, or what am I seeing, and things like that. Right. So they will also be communicating with some of these secondary areas, and we're going to talk about these cortical areas here. Basically, these secondary areas help us to make sense of a lot of the signals, and then they're going to be traveling, sending some signals back to the primary areas as well. So for instance, we're looking at things like, say for instance, the somatosensory cortex here is going to be receiving a lot of sensory signals. It's going to be transmitting over to say the primary motor cortex. But again, what did I say about, say, like the primary motor cortex versus like the accessory pathways or supplemental pathways? What's the difference between the two? So if you go back and you remember, if you go back and watch the video, you'll see that the primary motor cortex is good for kind of like large movements, right? Not really coordinated movements, not things like I need to write the letter A, but it's maybe things like raise your arm up, or kind of more kind of large sort of body movements there. So it's not really that detailed, but you have to have these other areas that are going to be communicating to actually make sure that you get these complex patterns are actually going to occur, right? So for instance, we have the supplementary and premotor cortexes are going to be functioning along with the basal ganglia to provide those movement patterns, right? So again, if I need to sequence out, say, 5 or 6 steps of movements I need to make in order to, say, get to the elevator and go down to my car, like that can occur there, and this communication is really important here. So there's also secondary sensory areas where this is where we actually have understanding of what we're seeing or hearing or smelling and being able to convert that into actual thoughts, right? So things like, interpreting shape or texture in the hands, right? And whenever you go to those Halloween parties when they're a kid and they're like, oh, you're touching a witch's hair, spaghetti, or the witch's eyeballs are grapes, right? So being able to determine the texture and things like that, even though you can't see it potentially, right? I guess I went to the lamer Halloween parties growing up, but things like interpretation of light and color, sound tones and sequence, things like that, being able to understand music. You need these secondary sensory areas to kind of pick up on that and be able to transmit it to the right areas to make sure that we can respond accordingly here, right? And so we're going to go over these more details in a second, but you basically can kind of break them up into these association areas here. So 2 of the main ones we're going to talk about, and there's a couple more, but things like the parieto-occipito-temporal association area. We'll talk about the prefrontal association area. These are going to be good for helping us to interpret the things that are happening in our world and being able to respond to that accordingly. Okay. All right. So looking at these association areas, basically when we're looking at the parieto-occipito-temporal association area, again, that's just telling you where it's at in the brain essentially. This is good for helping with analysis of things like spatial coordinates of the body. So being able to determine kind of where we're at in space and time and how we need to respond to that, right? Other big things you're going to see are the things like Wernickes Area. This is good for language comprehension. So you can see here, and again, the parieto-occipital-temporal association area is this whole kind of back portion here. You're going to notice language comprehension is really, really big here. Okay. Also, because again, when you say, for instance, when you read a book, do you like memorize what that image looks like of that page that you read, or do you convert it into thought? You convert it, right? So again, I don't have a photographic memory of every page I've read in a book. However, I can convert that into thoughts. That way, when I'm reading the physiology textbook and I'm trying to think of a good way to explain it to you guys, that conversion has to happen. And this is where things like Wernickes Area is going to be really good for language comprehension. It can kind of help with this. And again, one of the big reasons why we know what these different areas do is based on patients who have damage to those areas, right? So I'm going to show you a video a little bit later, maybe in the next time we meet, patients who have damage to these different areas. You can see how damaging one area versus another can lead to a totally different sort of problem, whether it's comprehension or whether it's maybe expressing things or whatever it happens to be. So we'll look at that a little bit later. But again, language is very important because again, we convert most of the thoughts and most things into language itself, right? Kind of like when you're talking to yourself, like this is what you're converting it into essentially. We're gonna have this angular gyrus area, which is kind of located around here, right around over here. Basically, it's going to be this helping with a visual association. It kind of feeds into that Wernickes area. So again, if I was say reading something, I can turn read words into language itself, right? So if I read the textbook and convert that into, okay, I'm talking about association areas, whatever it happens to be. Another area for naming objects. Again, this can combine heard words for object with visual inputs, right? So again, if I'm hearing something, I'm actually doing a lot of this with my 2-year-old right now, is like trying to just make associations between things. So I can say, okay, look, there's a door, and she says a door, and she can point to one, but then if I change the color of that door or a picture of a door, and now she can apply that to other doors that she sees. Or for instance, like, trying to think of another good example of it. Things like, flowers. Like flowers look very different from one another, but she can make that association between, okay, this is a flower, this one is, but this is also a flower, even though they're different. I'm trying to make sense of that, right? So I'm getting to see a lot of this development actually occur with her actually in real time, which is pretty cool. I think my 2-year-old's pretty cool, but you guys don't have to think that either. It's okay. We're also going to have the prefrontal association areas. We're going to go more into function here in just a little bit, but the prefrontal area is going to help with basically planning out patterns, planning out sequences of movements. A lot of executive decisions get made up here in the frontal area, and so you're going to see there's a big association with that parieto-occipital-temporal area. So again, there's a lot of communications that's going to be happening between these two, which is important because we need things like getting that sensory input or reading something and then helping to make decisions based off of that. Okay, so if I read something on the page and I'm trying to decide how am I going to explain that, the frontal area is going to kind of help with that. And again, very essential for the thought process, is going to help with both motor and non-motor information. And this is where we're actually going to be storing kind of short-term sort of working memories, right? So if I'm reading, say, something like a phone number, if I'm not committing it to long-term memory, this is where the prefrontal area is going to be able to help with that, and then keep it for kind of short-term sort of use there. Okay. Another big area is going to be called Broca's Area. You can see Broca's Area right here. This is important for word formation itself. So if I take all this information and I'm, say, reading off of a page or I'm hearing it, that's going to be working with Wernickes Area for that language comprehension. There's going to be some transmission here to Broca's Area, and this is where I actually get the word formation. So I'm thinking, okay, I need to say the word Broca. That's where that's occurring. And so, okay, how do I actually form that motor pattern to say Broca, right? And so again, that's going to be traveling up and working with the motor cortex, right? And basically saying, okay, here's how you need to move your larynx, here's how you need to breathe, here's how you need to move your lips, all of that good stuff happens right there. Very strong association with this. So for instance, when I show you those cases of aphasia later on, you can have damage just here to the word formation area, or you can have damage done here to the language actual comprehension area. So how do you think that might manifest differently if, let's say, someone just had damage done here to the word formation area?
So they won't be able to say it, they won't be able to speak, right?
Yeah, but do they understand what they want to say? Absolutely, right? So we call that an expressive aphasia, where they actually will be able to form the words in their head, but they can't actually make that connection to actually say the words in an appropriate sense, right? Some of you may think I had that problem most of the time, right? Yes, sir.
Dumb question. Is this connected to a stutter, maybe?
I don't know. It's a good question. I have no idea. If you want to look that up and maybe give us a good book report next time. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I have no idea, but could be multifactorial, but it could be related to some issue there. I'm not sure.
They write it down still?
Yeah, potentially if they, yeah, so again, yeah, so if it's, potentially they could still write effectively, it would just depend on basically where the damage is done. Again, these are a lot of like stroke patients, and so you can see sometimes bleed over, depending on where the actual stroke occurs, that may be affecting more than one sort of function. It just depends on, again, how extensive the actual damage is being done to the brain there, okay. Okay, we're also going to have the Limbic Association area, which we're going to see here. This is going to be helpful for things like behavior, emotions, motivation to do things like that. And actually, what's kind of interesting, there's a facial recognition area here, and if you have someone who has face blindness, or basically they can't tell the difference between two different people when they're looking at them, it's actually called prosopagnosia. And you may think most of the faculty here have that, but again, it's because we have to meet 64 new people every year or so. So give us a couple months, we'll get you guys' names down. But yeah, so basically, if you had the inability to kind of distinguish between two different people, they call that face blindness essentially. Okay, so going into more detail on Wernickes area, this kind of general interpretation sort of area, there's a lot of information that gets fed into Wernickes area because we need to convert a lot of things like, you know, if I smell, say, a hamburger, I need to convert that over. Okay, I know that smell is associated with the word hamburger, right? So again, that association there happens very much in Wernickes area. So again, we said if someone had a problem in Broca's area, they had, say, a stroke there, they would have a hard time formulating the words to actually say them. However, what if you had damage done to Wernickes area?
You'll say like random things.
Yeah, you wouldn't even come up with the actual words that you wanted to say. They just aren't able to actually comprehend what's actually happening. And again, it depends on the extent of the damage, but they won't be able to actually formulate the words in the first place to actually transmit that to Broca's area, to transmit to the motor cortex. So, and we'll look at that in a little bit later, just so you can actually see how that differently manifests itself. But very important, Wernickes area is for higher comprehension levels, right? Because again, most of the things that we're kind of inputting, all these sensory inputs, we're converting into words, and so language is a very important thing there, right? So for instance, if you have damage, you may be able to hear and recognize words, but you can't arrange them, say, into a coherent thought, right? Or the ability to read, but you're unable to recognize the thought that's actually being conveyed, right? You can read the same thing 10 times over, maybe not make any sense of it potentially. Or another area you could have damage to would be to the angular gyrus, and again, that's going to be incorporating visual cortex information, because again, the primary visual cortex is back here. If we can't have that communication happening here, they can develop this issue of word blindness, where basically they can't interpret the word meanings themselves. They may be able to read it, be able to know that that's a certain word, but they can't interpret what that word actually means potentially. And so this can manifest itself like dyslexia. So who's heard of like a dominant hemisphere before? Probably a pretty common sort of thing you think of. Now, most people, what is the dominant hemisphere for most people? Usually the left, right? Because remember, everything's kind of contralateral. So again, the left side usually controls things on the right side of the body, right? Or else crossing over in the spinal cord that occurs there. Well, basically, most people tend to be left hemisphere sort of dominant. And so about 95% of them, the rest of them either have kind of equal co-development of the hemispheres, or you're going to find it's very rare they would be completely right dominant, as the case may be. We'll talk about handedness in a few minutes here. But basically, when you have, say, a neonate who's developing their brain tissue, you're going to find that typically, for whatever reason, the Wernickes area in the left side of the left hemisphere tends to be bigger. And what you find is that just like with anything else, if it's bigger, it's going to get more use. It's going to basically develop, and so that's why you see the left hemisphere usually is going to be dominant for a majority of people you run into, because this larger side gains further dominance, just gets more use. Okay. And so you're also going to find the premotor speech area, right? So Broca's area, again, right before it's communicating to the motor cortex, is almost always dominant left hemisphere as well. So again, it just makes sense that most people tend to be left hemisphere dominant. Now in motor areas, you're going to find that for most people, they tend to be left dominant as well. However, who's left-handed around here? So maybe if we did the numbers, maybe roughly 10% or so. But yeah, so again, in those cases, that's where you can have handiness, where again we happen to have the motor areas there for things like eating or writing and things like that happen to be more dominant on our right side there. However, we have to have communication between the two areas, and that's where things like the corpus callosum is going to be very important there, where you can transmit signals from one hemisphere back to the other. And so what do you think would happen if you had, say, someone had a cut that was made between their two hemispheres and a corpus callosum was severed? There's some cool videos out there. I think some people actually have just kind of organic brain damage where they don't have that intact corpus callosum, and it's really kind of interesting because you'll see they don't have any kind of communication happening. Information's happening on the right side of the body, never makes it to the other side of the brain essentially. So you can't really process or use that information appropriately. So again, there's some videos out there you can watch, but it's very important. Corpus callosum allows for that communication between hemispheres there. Okay, so looking at language and these intellectual functions, so again, the majority of that sensory information I mentioned gets converted to language for both storage and interpretation, right? So if I smell a hamburger, I have to convert that smell sensation I'm getting into, that means hamburger, right? Because again, I don't remember the pages that I'm looking at on the textbook or something, but I remember the meaning. I convert that into a language that I can then store and then use later on, as the case may be. And again, we're also going to find that Wernickes area is also going to be associated with the temporal lobe, which is where you have a lot of your hearing areas as well, right? So again, we saw there's going to be feedback coming in from the visual cortex, from the auditory cortex. All of that's going to be communicating there with Wernickes area. So it's interesting is that you think, okay, the left hemisphere is dominant for most people. That's good for kind of higher intelligence, interpretation, things like that. Well, what do we use the other hemisphere for? It's non-dominant. Does that mean it just doesn't do anything? It's used for different things that you're going to find. So basically other types of intelligence. I wouldn't say for low intelligence sort of things, but just other types of things. So for instance, if you have the non-dominant hemisphere, oftentimes it gets used for things like interpreting music, more visual patterns, spatial relationships, even things like body language, right? So even though my wife may tell me everything's fine, my left hemisphere is probably like, oh, everything must be fine. She said so. But then my right hemisphere says, oh no, that body language means nothing is fine right now. So again, different type of intelligence. So being able to read that and interpret that information is very, very important. Again, if I didn't have that corpus callosum, maybe I couldn't make that connection there, and then I'd just be in trouble, or I'd be sleeping on the couch. But anyway, so again, very important there. It's still utilized just for different functions. And again, looking at destruction, say, of the dominant hemisphere, if you had, say, the left hemisphere, a left dominant person, you'd end up finding they would have a lot of problems with doing things associated with language, right? So they couldn't read well, they wouldn't be able to perform math problems, think through logic problems. So again, you think of those higher intelligence sort of features are going to be on the dominant hemisphere versus more things like, kind of consider like the artsy-fartsy side of the brain, are going to be related to that non-dominant sort of hemisphere, right? And any Rush fans out there? They have an album called Hemispheres, and you have like one guy on one side of the brain with the business suit, and the other guy's like naked, I think. I don't know what he's doing. He's like an art guy. But anyway, if you go look at that, that maybe can help to jog your visual memory there and help you make that association, right? We're already using our association areas. Okay. Think here. So looking at the prefrontal areas, I think I might actually call it here. What do you guys think? Please. How could I say no to such an impassioned plea for cessation? Okay, any questions I can answer before I let you guys go? Okay. I heard some complaints. People say we don't use up all of our time here. You're supposed to be here for 8 hours a day, and we don't use our time well. I want to make sure I use every minute I can. I'm just kidding. Okay, you guys can go.